Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
We are more than happy to have you all come, all our guests and our visitors and our members, to join us for this panel discussion this evening. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Tiffany Llewellyn, who is the president and founder of Adventists for Social Justice, which is an organization of about 4,500 members in the Adventist Church that are passionate about fighting for social justice issues. And so I'll turn it over to her, and she'll introduce each one of the panelists, and we'll begin our discussion.
So hello again, everyone. Hello. Hi. So this evening, we really want to have an engaging dialogue on this topic, which we'll get into a little further. I am only here to guide the conversation. We have a panel of what I consider to be experts to really delve deeply into these conversations. And so we'll converse for some time. We'll open up the floor for questions. We really want to be able to take this conversation, this topic, and this very meaningful and necessary dialogue further. And so first on our panel, for those of us who've been here all weekend, we have Pastor Randy Goldson, who is a native of the island of Jamaica. He migrated here to the U.S. after serving as an elder at the Little London SDA Church. He served as a science teacher at Manning School and has headed multiple community-based youth organizations. Pastor Goldson completed his B.A. in religion at Northern Caribbean University, his Master's of Arts in Religion at Yale University, and he is currently completing a Ph.D. in African religions at Temple University. He teaches an undergrad course in race and poverty at Temple as well. And both Randy and his wife, Oguchi, live here in the Maryland area. Randy's also a part of the ASJ executive body, where he serves as our chapter coordinator. And so we're really, really excited to have Pastor Goldson with us today. So Pastor Goldson, if you can just come on up and join the panel. Second on our panel, we have Dr. Iheanacho. Did I say that correctly? Iheanacho. Okay, who is a biomedical scientist who's making such a difference, a meaningful difference in the lives of Black and Brown people in our communities. Most notably, she was recently a part of a team that developed a vaccination for the Ebola virus, right? That's great. That's awesome. Wow. I'm telling you guys, we have the best of the best here this afternoon. You guys are in for a treat. I'm not going to... Iheanacho's interest in science began at a young age, tinkering in her father's garden, as you can read here in the panel. She has completed her doctoral work at Johns Hopkins University, where she focused on developing processes around type 2 diabetes, cancer, and diseases that particularly impact the African American community. And she is a change agent in her field, developing an association to support students of color, developing a mentoring network to expose other students to the science field, especially high school students, which is really, really important. And so Dr. Akunna, she has a strong sense of community service, which was instilled in her by her parents, and that has led her to choose and pursue a scientific path that impacts healthcare and the lives of individuals and communities. So can we welcome Dr. Akunna to the panel? Thank you so very much for joining us today. And how many of us were blessed by the message this morning? Amen. Powerful, powerful. We are excited. We call him the community godfather. That is Minister Ronnie Vanderhorst. We love him at ASJ. He was born in Youngstown, Ohio. He has been happily married and romantically involved with his wife, Janice. That is important. You have to make that distinction, right? For 36 wonderful and exciting years. I love the description of him. He has 2 adult daughters and a talented and creative granddaughter. Minister Vanderhorst is the co-founder of Prepare Our Youth, which is a nonprofit organization servicing children, youth, and families through education and counseling based in Washington, D.C. He has traveled abroad, lecturing, training, and preaching in Africa, Bermuda, and basically all across the globe. Wherever you have been, he has been there doing this work. He is an inspirational speaker, a mentor, a trainer, and an author. He has published articles on social, cultural, and spiritual concerns. He has written and published 8 books and is currently writing 5 more books. His favorite quote that I've adopted as my favorite quote, hands that help are holier than lips that pray. And so we want to invite Minister Vanderhorst to join us on the panel. We do have one more panelist that will be joining us shortly. So I don't want you all to be surprised when he comes in. His name is Andrew Johnson. He is also a part of the ASJ executive team. He is an education professional and an artist born and raised in New York. Andrew is a graduate of NYU, where he studied sociology and social and cultural analysis. He is also a music minister, where he started a small musical ensemble. He graduated from Fordham University with a master's in education and was a middle school classroom teacher. Andrew is currently planning to release his first EP in the fall and is pursuing a higher education access and pursuing a degree in entrepreneurship focused in entertainment and community arts programming. And so Andrew will join us a little bit later on the panel, okay? So I'm going to take my seat and we are going to start this conversation. So, hi everyone. Can you all hear me clearly on this mic? Okay, great. So my first question to the panel, or just to kind of start off this conversation, I felt it would be important for us to develop a framework in which we are going to engage what can be an extremely broad topic when we talk about the miseducation of Black separation and the path to reconciliation. And so my first question is, what comes to mind for you? What does this mean for you when we talk about Black separation? Can we get Pastor Goldson a mic? Oh, okay.
All right. So I think I've thought about it more in terms of what we are accomplishing with what we want to accomplish, which is Black unity, right? Because Black separation and the second part of our theme, a path to reconciliation, suggests that at some point, and more so the back to Wakanda kind of part of it, suggests that at some point there was Black unity, right? And so we're looking at the fact that people who identify as Black, and I don't know how much you want me to get into this idea of what Blackness is, how we're constructing Black, you know, in terms of, you know, on one hand, we're thinking about Black in very racialized, in a racialized way, as it's often deployed in the United States, which starts with the point of biological difference. So in most ways of articulating race, it starts with skin color, for example. As you know, you could pick up something like this in Winthrop Jordan's essay on kind of narrating from the very first time during the age of European discovery, when white folks, or you know, when Europeans went to the African continent and saw people with darker skin color, they started to deploy Black as, you know, the opposite of who they were, white. And so, you know, lots of the nursery rhymes and short little poems about Blackness emerged and Black people, one of which is accounting for why Black people came about in the first place. So they would say things like, you know, Python tried to overthrow the sun, and he went up in a chariot, and as punishment, he was burnt. He became like charcoal, and thereafter, all the people on this African continent became Black. And so Blackness was seen as a curse. So we're talking about that kind of thing on one hand. But then, you know, with the critical turn in kind of race studies, we're thinking of blackness and black, and when we talk about black people, more so as a sociological construct, right? That this is not something that's a given. Yes, there's difference in terms of our skin tone or our color, but that's just what it is, a difference, right? A phenotypic difference. And I won't get into your scientific analysis or articulation of it, but that's what it is. So, so when we're talking about black right now, yes, in a sense, it will come to our mind that we're sketching this kind of sociological construct which reflects critically on differences in skin color. But I'm more so interested in talking about black as people who identify with the African continent as their ancestral home, right? And I think that's broad enough to account for people in the West Indies, people in Latin America, African Americans, and people in Europe, wherever they are, Polynesia, whatever. So if you're identifying with the African continent as your ancestral home, so then we're talking about these people, us, who identify with Africa, a geographic place as ancestral home, being united, coming together, you know, outside of hostility, divisions, and divisiveness. All right? It's not about sameness. It's not trying to speak with one voice or operate with one polity. That's not it. But recognizing our differences, cooperating, working together in terms of alliance building. So even black unity itself, I feel like it's part of the miseducation, because we push this narrative so much that we've sort of tried to blend out important differences. So we think that, you know, in order to be united, then we have to be saying the same thing. Garvey's my guy, but, you know, part of the problem with the UNIA in the 1920s, the 1930s, was that, you know, Garvey wanted this, yes, the one aim, the one mission, the one goal kind of thing, which in effect was asking people from all of Africa and the African diaspora to operate in the same way. That's not necessary to achieve black unity. I think what we want is ultimately alliance among ourselves, as well as respect and recognition of our differences and working together corporately for the good of each person that identify with the African continent as ancestral home.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think you covered everything in that statement.
I'm sorry. That's why I can't go
No
first.
need to
long-winded.
No need to apologize.
I think that's great and very foundational in our discussion, in our conceptual framework moving forward. As it pertains to black separation, Dr. Naim Akbar said something very interesting. He said that the Holocaust for the Jewish, Eastern European Jews or whatever, was like 11 years at max. But with the enslavement of African people, 400 years and ongoing oppression, Dr. Akbar said, we have lost our collective mind. And I believe that that is essential in this particular discussion of losing our collective mind. And that is a very profound loss. We all know of Dr. Desmond Tutu and his, he said that when the European came to Africa, we had the land and he had the Bible. He said, let us pray. And when we opened our eyes, he had the land and we had the Bible. And that has been a profound separation as it pertains to our people, not only from land, but also in relationship.
So we're going to pause and invite up Andrew Johnson to the panel. So when I hear the term the miseducation, that tells me that there was some teaching that occurred at some point. And as a clinician, I always think of what was taught that has then influenced behavior and influenced who we are. And so can anyone on the panel provide a place at some point in history where you believe this miseducation first began, and what has been the implications of that in a tangible, realistic way to get us to the point of this conversation today?
Well, I think it just depends on which group you want to start with. You could talk about what happened when Europeans came and colonized, well, wherever they colonized, and the impact on the people in that region, whether it was in the Caribbean, whether it was in Africa, and then ultimately when slaves were brought here to the US. I feel that that education was the same regardless of which particular region or people you're talking about. And the sense of looking at other human beings as less than, the sense that looking to create divisions and divisiveness even within people from the same country. Look at the Tutsis and the Hutus. They're one people, but Europeans came in and said, well, you look this way and you look that way, so we're gonna call you this and we're gonna call you that. And that created divisions that still last even to this day. So I think that type of education was part of how they decided to subjugate people and to control not only economically, but control psychologically. And I feel that that continued even here in the US with slaves, and then continuing on past slavery to, you look at things like COINTELPRO and what they did with the Black Panther movement. And I think it continues on. And that's up to 70s, 60s, 70s, and I'm sure it's still even occurring now, we just might not know about it. But even with the Black Lives Movement, look at some of the backlash that has come about as a cause of that. So I feel as though the strategies are the same, and they're executed on small or large scale. So macro scale, micro scale, they're still doing it wherever they go.
I guess for particular to the conversation that we're having here, I think a lot of the miseducation may have started, or did indeed start with sort of how white people had to, or in America, right? I guess I'd speak in that context, particularly had to kind of make slavery and oppression of other people okay for themselves. So it's coming from a point where you had racist scientists, right, or racist scientists will put out racist studies, right, that would sort of reinforce the ideas that they wanted to have about black people, right? And they'd say, oh, well, your skull looks like this, and you're like this, and then the other group is like this. And that followed in terms of making, chattel slavery, which is an American version of slavery, okay with caricatures, right, or stereotypes of black people that made white folks feel comfortable with this idea, with what they were doing. So you see caricatures of the black mammy, right? So you see black women being seen as caretakers, right? Aggressive, administrative, right? Just sort of leaders of their household, right? And in a way, sort of usurping or undermining black men in that way. You see caricatures of the coon, right, or somebody that's happy with slavery, and all these sorts of ideas, right? Then you have like the Sambo, you have these different caricatures that were reinforced through media, right, that made this okay. And the media is very powerful in America. And once the media gets a hold of something and they begin to sort of rotate and continue to push these images out, this is how these people sort of begin to have ideas about what black people are like, right, quote unquote. And so that is followed up, I guess, in relevance to our conversation, because no one wants to be seen that way, right? So you come to the American project, or you come to America from another place, and you're realizing like, okay, there are all these ideas about black folks, and there's the coon, and there's this one, and you know, these caricatures develop and, you know, expand and contract over time, depending on what folks want to, you know, push, right? And so even in regards to contemporary artists, right? I don't know if you guys listen to some contemporary artists, but a lot of contemporary artists there's a bit of a conversation around whether some contemporary artists are caricatures and whether that makes them more palatable for white audiences, right? And the problem that might exist in that. So I think that then this comes to sort of a distancing that we sort of understand in sociology that takes place with many immigrants, called black distancing, right? You don't want to be seen as black. You definitely don't want to be seen as black American, because you realize all of these things. When you get here, you realize all of these things that are associated with the idea of being black and what that means. So I think that can just kind of add to the, you know, the education.
In addition to that, and a good reference for what Andrew was alluding to is called Split Images. Jeanette Dates was a professor at Howard University who really deals with the caricatures in media and so forth. There is also, in addition, a faulty theological foundation. We know that when a person seeks to oppress, Europeans seek to oppress, they go at two things. They go at the religion and they go at the language. But the faulty theological premise that we see comes from what's called the estates, the four estates. The first estate is the oligarchy, those who control. And the second estate is the clergy, which gave the so-called theological foundation as far as the curse of Ham and whatever so-called biblical foundations that they devised to say that God is backing what we do, be it enslavement, oppression, or whatever else like that. That theological foundation that gives justification. The third estate is the laborers who do the work of the oligarchy. But then there's the fourth estate, and that is the press, who is actually the voice of the oligarchy to be able to take all of their propaganda and so forth and send it to us, be it theologically or whatever else, to justify some type of theological foundation for the oppression. I will say this: white supremacy is a doctrine of devils.
Oh, I don't know where I can come in. Oh my God, so much. So yeah, I think I want to pick up on the last point here of white supremacy, right? And the kind of the ideological and epistemological frameworks that contribute to our oppression. And I think that's something that we continue to struggle with, even you know, as people who are more educated, you know, talking about millennials than any other period, more degree than any other folks in history. But then the basic tenets, the basic what Foucault would talk about, the discursive practices, are things that go into making something and validating something as truth, as fact, as the point that you should accept. Those things have not changed. Those models remain the same. And until we start to take apart the core of our you know, our educational you know, foundation, these epistemological positions, then we're only perpetuating whiteness and white supremacy, right? And I think the characterization is absolutely right. And so we're teaching more, but then we're not really getting to the point where what we're learning is liberatory. It's emancipatory for our people. So that's why we have, you know, even within, I just use it, the black community, you have these separations, very classist structures. Because, you know, once you've gotten education, and then, you know, we start to rank it from those that are, you know, Ivy Leagues, you know, the predominantly white institutions, and we tear it down to different types of HBCUs, and we rank them. So once I've gotten education, once I'm getting money, then what happens? I need to move out of a certain community. I need to distance myself from certain people. And then we have to ask, why do these practices perpetuate? Even within church structures that are supposed to be the places where everyone is equal at the foot of the cross, you don't have that. You have these hierarchies existing. And I think what we have to get to in understanding what went wrong is that the models have not changed, right? You know, most of what we still hold on to these Enlightenment ideas, which are the same ideas that contributed to our enslavement, and incidentally, the so-called same ideas that contributed to folks in America saying, well, we can't take slavery anymore in this continent because it's so yesterday, we're done with it. So the North started to push this idea and said, you know, if we're enlightened people imbued in this liberal idea, then we can't have slavery. And, you know, we know the tensions that emerged around the 1850s and culminated in 1865. Right? So I think we still struggle with the model of education where it is still a white-centered, or I would say a Eurocentric model of education. And until we get to that foundation and move towards an Afrocentric, and maybe, you know, somebody told me last week at a church, no, we should talk about a Christocentric. I'm like, well, that's fine if we know what the Christocentric is, because sometimes when we say Christocentric, it still goes back to the default Eurocentric mode. So we have to talk about education that is not oppressive, that will not result in us seeing, accepting meritocracy as like the basis of how we're going to do things. So those of us who have the privilege, continue to build the privilege and the access and disenfranchise others. And I'm talking about black folks doing this to black folks, right? So we have to get at some of these things, practices that will not result in us so deep in capitalism and economic injustices that, you know, we continue to widen the gap between the rich and the poor. So these are parts of it where the education itself, the very tenets of the education, the epistemological framework of it is wrong. It's oppressive. It's white. And we need liberation from that. We need to have sort of a thing like, you know, Maroons were able to disengage both ideologically and physically from the plantation complex. So we have to have some process of disengaging from this complex of the white dominance and white framework to something that's more inclusive and more liberatory. And I think that's just a small part of the miseducation. There's so much more to it.
Good, good. I want to take us back just a little bit because when we have conversations around enslavement and being brought from the continent to here and so forth, we can speak for hours and hours. There's a tension that has now been, to some degree, very much ignored or silenced to some degree, and that's the interracial piece that we're here to talk about today. And when we think of Caribbeans, Africans, African Americans, and we talk about this separation, it's very real. It's very much prejudiced in many, many ways. And I know we do have great representation on our panel today that can speak to these different experiences. As a Caribbean immigrant myself, just the view or the teaching on African Americans before you even get here, and how that can become a very biased view and lead to separation. Africans coming here, African Americans being here, and their own concept of blackness. And so from each perspective, can you all talk a little bit about your background and how that has, and not to speak for the entire group, but some of the teachings have been definitely generalized, how that has and continues to lead to this separation.
Well, I think back to even as a little girl. I was born in Nigeria. My mother is from Barbados, so I have not only Caribbean ancestry, I also have African ancestry, but then I grew up in the US. And how when we first moved here, they made fun of me because of how I talked. Why do you have this accent? Did you live in a jungle? Did you have running water? All of the misconceptions, whereas, I mean, honestly, we moved to a 2-bedroom apartment when we first moved to the States. We lived essentially in a mansion when we were in Nigeria. I had my own servants. So the concept of coming from a jungle where that was this uncivilized place, and they had these conversations with me frequently as if, yeah, we know this is commonplace, so tell us what it was like. Were there a lot of animals roaming around? And then also learning or hearing the perspective of, well, Americans, they don't want to do anything, they're lazy. So I think just framing the conversation where we're beginning to share our own stories, our own oral history, putting aside what we may have been told or what we were taught, and just having those conversations. For Caribbeans or Africans, coming to the realization of how disenfranchised African Americans were here, living here in the US, and opening up the conversation so that we can begin to tell and share our stories instead of listening to what others have tried to tell us.
Okay, so I'm not gonna talk about, I don't know. Let me talk first. I know we're kind of sketching it broad with the relationships among African Caribbean, but I want to talk about relationship among Caribbean folks. Because the Caribbean is it's very vast, right? And I think the relationships are not that great. And while over the years our leaders have tried within the Caribbean region to kind of mitigate some of the little explosive stuff, every now and then an incident happens, and then it's a war again. So there's the most contentious groups in the Caribbean would be Jamaicans versus Trinidadians, Jamaicans versus Bajans. And so those are the 3 largest groups. Not Jamaica is the largest geographic in terms of size, but in terms of economy, Barbados and Trinidad would, and Jamaica, they're up there. And so within the region, there's a tension between the countries, the islands in the Greater Antilles. These are the bigger islands, including Jamaica, and the Lesser Antilles, where you have Trinidad, Barbados, and all those eastern Caribbean islands. So there's tension, and this goes way back. So the genesis of that tension would be how colonization and enslavement played out in the region. Because while the British eventually colonized and enslaved most of the region, you had Spanish territories there, and you had the Portuguese taking different parts. So how that played out, and the kind of active hostility that even the colonizers, the enslavers, pushed as a way of keeping things in check. So that happened. And so in the post-emancipation period, beginning in 1830s, Antigua 1833, coming into the post-emancipation period, starting around 1960, what you've had, particularly in the 50s, were efforts by leaders to call what they had was regional integration. And then this brings into question how US politics interfere within regional politics and kind of create some of these divisions. Because if your country is supported and you have the good deals with the northern powers and you're doing well, then you want to preserve wealth for your people. So this kind of insularity emerges. And so even though we've had a treaty since the 70s among the Caribbean, the 15 main Caribbean, larger Caribbean territories, that eventually allowed for free trade and free travel. We still have barriers to entry because, we've been sold a narrative hey, if Jamaicans come into the Bahamas, then they're going to bring crime. So all the stereotypes, we start to pass them around. And, if the Haitians come over, oh, my God, they're so awful. They'll work voodoo. They will bring their, believe it or not, they'll bring their evil practices here. So we start to feed into some of these stereotypes. And again, with Haiti in particular, that again goes back to the Haitian Revolution. The Haitians overthrew the French army. The U.S., as an ally of France, literally parking a warship at the mouth of Haiti, demanding for them to pay reparations, which they didn't pay back until 2002. And so virtually impoverishing the country, stereotypes that emerged about Haiti and fed across the region. So this kind of contributes to it. And even when Caribbean folks come to the U.S. now, and all of this plays out, particularly in Brooklyn, New York, you see all the tensions, the pockets of Jamaicans, the pockets of Bajans, and the tension is real. And we can't work with each other. So we have tried regionalism in the 1950s with the West Indies Federation. It failed because of that thing of insularity. So my prime minister at the time, Bustamante, would say that 1 minus 10 leaves 0. Basically saying if Jamaica backs out of this deal, then nothing will happen, and it's eventually what happened. And then we have tried the CSME, and we're still struggling with it, right? And the tensions are there. And so even before we talk about how Caribbean folks are relating to African Americans and African folks, we can't even relate to ourselves, right? And then that tension is there. And so, I mean, my experience of coming here, I came as an adult. I came here 5 years ago, and I guess I came in a different way. I came for school, grad school. I went to a predominantly white institution, an Ivy League institution. So the discourse and the operation within that bubble was quite different. When we talk about political correctness, it's perfected in that context. So, but people could sense, at least within the divinity school, some tensions between, my year was historic in having perhaps the most black students admitted in the history of the divinity school. So, some tensions were there, but for the most part, people got along. Being here for 5 years now, I'm more introduced to the stereotypes through literature and not necessarily through experience. So it's a different context for me. I'm married to a Nigerian woman, and just to show you, I probably shouldn't say that. I'll stop there. I think it's wise to stop.
Yeah. So I guess to follow up or to bridge from Randy's point, and I think I heard Randy mention earlier the Maroons in Jamaica, which I'm of Jamaican heritage, so this was something my mom told me about growing up, and I was like, okay, Ma, great, like these fairy tales that you have about what this means, just kind of focused on trying to be the best American I could, and so it becomes interesting when so you have this particular kind of history in Jamaica, right, with the Maroons. So essentially, you got a bunch of folks that never been slaves, and like you said, are disengaged from that, right, or fought about not wanting to be there. And you have an island that really started was conquered by the Spanish, right, and then you got they pretty much everyone becomes Jamaican in that regard when the British show up to take over the island, right, and so you have Spanish. I don't know, I guess they would call themselves conquistadors, but yeah, Spanish conquistadors. You got some free Africans, right, that they brought over to Jamaica from Europe, and you got some folks that were brought over to be slaves. But everyone, all of a sudden, when the British show up, none of that matters anymore, right? Because everyone's kind of got to defend where you're at. So you have that partaking in the heritage of the island. When I started thinking about other islands and their ideas of Jamaica, they would say that we're aggressive, we're loud, we think we're the best, right? We don't, a lot of the other islands would say we don't behave well, right? And I'm sure some of you are like, yeah, that's them, right? That's Jamaicans, that's them, right? And I even had a professor who mentioned that, his parents are from St. Thomas, and they would say, okay, we're from the better behaving islands than Jamaica, right? Which is all really interesting, and you can see a lot of characteristics of Jamaicans as to why they would say that. And a lot of that is coming out of a nation that was founded that had people that weren't slaves, that were adamant about their freedom, that were aggressive about it, that were, if the Maroons held the British off and won wars against them, right? The Imperial British won wars against them and established a free, community where they were free, even years in advance of the Haitian Revolution. So you're talking about a nation that was seen, even in the Caribbean, as a problematic space. When people had problems with their slaves, they would send them to Jamaica, right? You're talking about a gentleman called Bukuman, who was instrumental in the Haitian Revolution, coming from Jamaica, right? Because his owner just said, okay, enough of you. I'm sending you out, over to Haiti. And we see Bukuman, and I'm forgetting the name of the other gentleman, the lady, that they were sort of both responsible for, pushing a lot of energy through the Haitian Revolution past Toussaint L'Ouverture and just really rallying the people up, right? Just a note about that, like they called him Bookman in Jamaica. There's a little bit of an accent in Haiti, but no one knows if it was the Bible he was carrying or the Quran. But anyways, it was because he always walked with this book. But apart from that, he was really aggressive, really, problematic. So now, when you examine these histories, it's easy to see why people would say, okay, yeah, we're from the better behaving islands, right? What does that mean when you say that you're better behaving, right? More Anglo-conforming, right? Less resistant about, right, your freedom, right? And so we see that we begin to sort of take these ideas on about each other, right? Jamaica coming, the numbers in which Jamaica comes to the States sometimes then tends to overrepresent us among Caribbean folks, right? So you have non-Caribbean folks that think anyone with an accent that sounds a particular way is Jamaican, right? And then so you have other islands that resent that, like, I'm not Jamaican. Like, why do y'all think everybody's Jamaican, right? And then you got Jamaicans that are like, yeah, that's us. Like, that's the energy. And so you have those things together that cause a lot of tension. And you can see that even now with Jamaica, where you have like a high, rate of violence and crime, is because that same aggressive energy, there's almost like no one's regulating it. Barbados, you don't really have, in those sort of other, you don't have that same. So there's highs and lows, and there's, all these semantics are really important in terms of seeing clearly and in multiple dimensions about what's happening in our groups. Apart from that, I think it was really a salient point that you mentioned about growing up in America with parents from another country. So it was similar for me. Like, I didn't necessarily feel like they were making fun of me for my accent, which I shouldn't have had because I was born here. But my parents sent me to Jamaica growing up, and so that was like, my first language. My grandma raised me a lot of times. That's what she spoke. She didn't speak standard English. I was gonna say proper, right? Got to watch your language. Very powerful, right? She didn't speak standard English. What she spoke to me was Jamaican patois, so that's what I knew. And so I could communicate that way, but I had to learn that, like, in school, we had to do this thing called speak, which is another thing that I recognize that Jamaicans would say. So there's, like, my aunt said to my cousin, when you go to school, are you going to speak? And she's like, what do you mean, am I going to speak? Like, of course I'm going to speak. Teacher asked me a question. But she didn't mean that. She meant, are you going to put on, the English? So because that's where I'm coming from. So the questions about animals in the yard and different stuff like that and running water for me was like, yeah, I could see why they would ask that, because that was a part of the reality of where I was coming from. Like, we went out with goats. My uncle had, my granddad had cows. You had to, like, I grew up in the country. So that was like a part of the experience. And it was, I didn't necessarily, so long story short, just sort of taking all of this in, you do recognize that you're an other. You recognize very early that you're an other. And I think that that's a part of the conversation that's missed, because so much of us are adamant about our black distancing, which is essentially what it is, that it's missed that in the beginning, you are told by other African Americans that you're not, something's off, you're not really black. I have people tell me that all the time. I had a best friend who was African American who told me that I wasn't really black because I didn't eat collard greens. Right? And, cornbread and all the delicious sort of traditional African-American foods, right? I didn't eat that. So for them, he couldn't make sense of me. He couldn't make sense of me because here I am, darker than he is, but he couldn't make sense of who I was and why I did the things I did. They had all these name brand, stuff on, and I interviewed a Grenadian friend because I kind of studied these tensions in when I was in undergrad for my thesis class, and I interviewed a Grenadian friend who said, she found African Americans very intimidating. Because when you're coming from such a small background and you don't know much about the place around you, and you're looking at folks who have a great command of that, you can feel very intimidated. And when she talked about the brand clothes, then I kind of remembered. Because my mom was not going to buy me Jordans. Like, to this day, she probably wouldn't buy me a $300 shoe, right? And so you can feel, when that's the get-in and the get-up, you can feel very intimidated around that. So there are a lot of tensions that happen early around language, around food, around culture that make you feel very othered. And you fast forward to what for me was, I guess, integrating with white folks, and they kind of congratulate you on your otherness. They kind of feel safe about it. They kind of, their idea of Jamaica is like, yeah, one love, Caribbean people, like, yeah. And for so many of us in the Caribbean, I guess, someone said it brilliantly, the colonizers went home. So we're still coming up in a time and a legacy where our culture was validated, where who we are and who we wanted to be was validated. We created it for ourselves. We saw bankers, we saw lawyers, we saw pastors. We have our culture at our backs. Whether it's West Indian or African, we're coming from spaces where we see people do what we want to do, right? And we know that we have this culture behind us, which the power of that can't be overstated, because there's so much of the tension is kind of like a who do you think you are thing, but it's like, I know who I kind of am, and I guess there is that tension because of your historical legacy being different from mine. So because the colonizers went home, we have our dishes, and we have our food, and we have our music, and we have our dance, and we have so many things that we also feel are being overlooked when people don't see us as Trinidadian, that don't see us as Grenadian, that want to call us African American, and we're not a part of that culture. And I also want to just say out here that these tensions happen and cause rifts, but it isn't true that this has always been the case, right? Early on, when you see early Black immigrants coming to the States, particularly in Harlem, you see the Harlem Renaissance being led by a lot of first-generation immigrants or brothers and sisters from the Caribbean who were adamant about sort of a collective political Black ideology, right? And I think that that's something that I would want to drive home tonight, is that we have to see the politics of race, not necessarily what we think about it or what we feel about it, or, engaging in separatism by tribe or by how we feel. We will all have our own culture, but in America, it is important to see the politics of race, because as we are all Black, as they label us, right, we have a historical legacy in this nation to contend with, where we are affected, number one, by diabetes, HIV. We're number ones affected, right? Miseducation, we're the number one people affected by that, right? Poor education systems, regardless of whether you're Jamaican or Nigerian or Ghanaian, or, right? And you have to really contend with this if you're going to continue to be an African American. And that's like, it's taken me a while to own being a first generation African American, right? I like to say that I'm a Jamaican American, but essentially, if I plan to stay here in this country, I'm going to be walking in the African American legacy, even as a Jamaican, right? And so it's important for me to understand my race as a political thing, as opposed to a label of me being something that I'm not, right? Because when racism comes down, they're not stopping to ask. When that cop, right, sees you, they're not stopping to ask, like, which kind of Black are you, right? Or any of that. So we've got to begin to sort of see ourselves, like, race as political. And I think that, again, our culture being at our back is something that we should be proud of and be careful with it, because our brothers and sisters that are African American have dealt with 300 years of that being erased, right? Of that being systemically and, like, just oppressed and, sort of stomped out, right? And they're dealing with being exploited by the American capitalistic system, right? Which is something that we don't necessarily have an intimate knowledge about. So we come here and we stand on a lot of the shoulders and work of those people who have saw themselves as Black Americans, right? All the rights that we enjoy, all the the progression that we've made in this nation is as a result of that work, right? And so there's no, it can't be beneficial to begin now to say that we are, because we have the opportunity to go to, the Ivy League schools or to go to prestigious universities, to have particular kinds of jobs, to be in particular spaces, to sort of separate ourselves. And you have to watch this, and this will be my last point, because I don't want to keep, going, but you have to watch this because the power of it can't be overstated. When you look at years and years and years of people saying, oh my gosh, this black student got accepted to all the Ivy Leagues, right? And you look at the student and they're a West Indian, right? Or they're African, right? It's almost like, and again, you have to be careful of how whiteness works, because here's a moment to uplift this person, to say anyone can do it. Not really, because the oppression has been so real. The oppression has been so real that a lot of the things and a lot of us come from, middle class backgrounds in a lot of these. That's another thing. From a lot of these islands, our parents had jobs. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say that's necessarily my background, but my grandfather definitely worked and provided and allowed for the opportunities to apply to come abroad, which we don't necessarily see. And when we think about stuff and we compare ourselves and say, okay, African Americans are lazy, because we've made the choice to come to this nation says something particular about us or about our parents, right? That we're willing to take that leap. I'm sure we could think about other people back at home that wouldn't do it or wouldn't make it, right? And so you have to kind of keep all these things in mind to understand that there's a lot at work here. Class, right? Your own personal sort of motives, and your own ability to sort of make it work coming to a new country. But when you see these students being accepted to all Ivy League schools and they're being it's something to pay attention to, because you want to celebrate them in one end. But the fact that it's not an African American, for me, still says that it's a problem. It's not enough for me that this person is of an immigrant background, because that doesn't say that they're doing right by the people that they initially disenfranchised. And if they don't have access to this in the same way, or they're not performing the same way, then we should pay attention to how and why there are these gaps in performance, right? And not use it as a moment to say, see, look, we're doing this, or you know what I'm saying? The easy things to fall into.
Minister Villa, I would love to hear from you as an African American on the panel.
Well, my experience is very short and very different. And I think it comes down to the point for me of lack of exposure. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, a steel town, a great place to be rooted in. My family, as well as the village, church, and community that I was rooted in. But it was not until 1972 that I met my very first Caribbean brother. I didn't know any growing up in Youngstown, Ohio, at all. We just had African Americans. We had Italians that lived on the west side of town. And so my lack of exposure is, I think, a pertinent point also in division. When I came to the DMV area was the first time I met an African Caribbean. And so I was more in observance mode than anything else. I got to meet Africans from the continent. It was very interesting, though, is that we never, ever broke bread together. We never, ever coalesced in some type of way or another, basically, for me to gain knowledge of them and for them to gain knowledge of me, who I am as an African American man. Consequently, with the lack of exposure comes innuendos, assumptions about my people of other cultures. And I think that that plays a very interesting part in the divisions that we have also, because of the lack of exposure, the lack of relationship. And so we just form our conclusions. And one of my personal quotations is, first impressions are the only impression. And it could be the wrong impression at the same time also. But lack of exposure is a key point in the separations of us as a people.
Yeah, and I think that lack of exposure is just so much more prominent, whether we're looking at our communities or our churches where we still worship largely just together in our cultural spaces together, and many of our circles still do promote this lack of exposure. And I guess the question is, how do we intermingle and intertwine more and open ourselves up to learning about the other and this concept of what that feels like? I wanted to also talk a little bit, Andrew touched on a really, really important point where we hold these national affiliations so dearly, and we come here and we are rooted in our culture. However, within the American context, Black is just Black. When we talk about social justice and we talk about our racism and many of these experiences that we see plastered across social media, or we experience ourselves in schools, on the street with the police, etc. Research has been showing that non-African American males are the first of immigrants to begin to embrace this concept or this idea of Blackness from an American perspective, because of their interactions with the police and how when they are in social spaces, it doesn't matter if they're from and none of these countries, none of these places that we come from, they are just viewed as Black. For the men on the panel that are not, well, Andrew, you did share that you're African American, but have a very rich Jamaican upbringing. Do you see that in your social circles, or even for the women on the panel, do you feel like there are points of entry for immigrant women into this concept of Blackness that comes from experienced racism within the American society?
Oh, most assuredly. When I was not viewed as Afro-Caribbean or African. I was viewed as Black. In fact, I tried to get some numbers while I was at Hopkins for my department. I just wanted to know how many people of color had matriculated through the department. I graduated from there almost 5 years ago. I still don't have an answer to that question. No one could tell me even how many. They wanted to count me, but technically, although I'm a naturalized US citizen, I am not what you would call your, I guess, traditional African American. So in that context, no, they view me as Black. All they see is Black. They don't see Nigerian, they don't see Bayesian or from Barbados. They just see Black. That is the same not only in terms of educational institutions, that's the same. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. There are people that followed me around the store for no other reason other than I was Black. There are times when I was pulled over by police officers for no other reason than I was Black. So what they see or what they perceive me as being is just Black. They don't care about my ancestry, my makeup. They just see me as Black.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, from like viewed from like a larger perspective of the institution, of course, you know, you'll be seen as Black, but so for all the educational institutions I've attended in the U.S. and you know the one I'm still attending, from the admissions perspective, Black, right? But then once you're working within your department, then you know your individual nationality will come out. And I'm very loud about being Jamaican, Andrew. I'm very loud about it. So they know I'm from the Caribbean. They hear the accent. They know I'm Jamaican. In terms of like outside of the academic space, and I've been stopped by the police once for speeding. So I can't say it was because I'm black while I was stopped. I couldn't fairly make that assessment, and I didn't get a ticket. He said, just take it easy, man. And he had me sign a thing to say that he didn't pull me over because I was black. So, all right, so, yeah, right. But I can say that in terms of what we'd call racialized microaggressive behaviors, definitely you'll have those constantly within the academic space. So, I mean, I've been called, so my good friend Kirkland is here. Both of us were at YDS together. So I've been called Kirkland multiple times. He has been called Randy multiple times. So I feel like the lack of effort on the part of white people to understand you as a person, as an individual, even though I was at YDS long before any other Jamaicans showed up, they started to confuse us. I remember, is this live stream? Okay. I remember at one point reading in the chapel, and a professor made a comment, which, sometimes they say stuff, and you have to stop. Is this a compliment or a diss? Right? He says, oh, that's an interesting Anglo-Caribbean accent or whatnot, it was said. But the way in which it was said, you felt like, this person wasn't really complimenting me on the way I read, but there was something else going on. But in terms of the overt dismissal of you as a person because of your blackness, I can't honestly say that I've experienced that. And I'm not oblivious to the fact that as long as I stay in these United States, that is just a matter of time before that manifests in very profound ways. But in terms of these racialized microaggressive behaviors, yes, they've been there with the name thing, with comments about your accent, with being told you switch from biblical studies to Africana studies. That's a good thing because, it's always good to look like what you teach or to teach what you look like, right? So, and you could tell on one end it was meant to be a compliment, to say, yeah, I'm encouraging you to do this. But then you stop and think about it, nah. Would you say that to a white student wanting to teach microbiology, for example, right? So these are things, and I think, I'll have more stories to share as time goes on because, this is the United States. Racism is real. It's real as night and day.
How do we get more? Oh, where you go? Oh, I thought you were saying. How do we get more immigrants engaged in the work of social justice? Because Andrew highlighted a point that I, we've been wrestling with, even within the ASG and Adventism space, where we are so disconnected from how these social issues that we, I guess, relegate to an African American issue or fail to truly think about how much we benefit from the loss of lives and the sacrifice and all that African Americans went through for our freedoms, the freedoms that we migrate to enjoy, the freedoms that we bring our families here to benefit from. And we come here and yes, we are somehow patted on the back by white people at times for being a different type of black. And when we talk about social justice work, and we talk about community engagement and building up black communities, it's sometimes very difficult to bring Caribbeans or African immigrants into this work. How do we really bring our communities into the work of social justice advocacy, understanding that it's almost a right and a duty for us to be a part of fighting against injustice and really realizing how much we have benefited from African Americans that we ignore and we choose not to participate in?
I think when you at the crux of it, they have to stop viewing themselves as other. When you view yourself as other and distinct and separate from African Americans or this population of people, I think that's the only time in which you can actually get them actively involved and bring them in. When you stop viewing it as, well, that's a separate and distinct class of people or population of people that are different from me, that's when I think change will start to happen.
Another point is that social justice is a call. And I do believe that sometimes there is more accentuation on career than call. When a person understands the call of God on their lives, there should be an undergirding of Luke 4:18. The Spirit of Yahweh is upon me, because he has appointed me to deal with the oppressed, to break chains and so forth. And sometimes that running after that dollar or the cares of life or the deceitfulness of riches can choke out the call to social justice. In addition to that, it's understanding God's purpose for our lives also. See? And purpose may be found in a few different areas. God's purpose for your life may be found in a problem that we see that must be answered. God's purpose for our life may be found in a passion. There is something that's standing so tall in our minds, eclipsing all other interests. Maybe I need to pursue that, look into that. Purpose can also be realized through pain. That something has happened, or we see the inhumanity of man against man, and we have to do something about that. So basically, the calling on our lives has to come from an intimate relationship, in my belief system, with Christ, to understand and identify his purpose for my life. But even outside of that context, a person can engage in social justice through a passion, through a problem, or through pain. I will finally say this, though. One of the greatest things the Holy Spirit has taught me in counseling is to know when I'm not the one to do it. And so everything is not for everyone. And zeal without knowledge, it gets you killed quick. And so when a person is pursuing social justice, count the cost and see if I am willing to go the whole 9, or whether I might need to be in a supportive role to help finance or to be a human resource or something.
Yeah, and so, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about this thing of alliance, and I spoke a little bit about it last night, because, and I like the category immigrants, not just black immigrants or immigrants from West Indies, but it's sort of of all the immigrant groups, Asians are the least involved in social justice issues. Like, that's the narrative that's put out there. And then, the others coming down. And I know particularly with Caribbean immigrants, Jamaican immigrants, you don't see them, you don't see us on the front lines. You don't see us getting excited or hey, we have to, join a movement to deal with this issue, because I don't know, there's the tendency among our people to say, just keep your head down. There's a proverb that said, you come to drink milk, come to count cows. So, know what you want, make the money, get the education. So, the career thing, make the money, build a house back home, and you can opt out when you're ready, right? So there's, and the Africans know what I'm talking about, because that kind of mindset is there. You know, you just come to get this. You don't come to park and to be permanent. So you just work enough that once you retire, the house is back, the compound is all set, you're out, right? So that is there. So sometimes there's an insensitivity. And it doesn't have to be your experience for you to be an ally. Because, you know, we're looking at the thing from the perspective of what is just and what is an injustice. And so if you recognize something as an injustice, then, you know, you have, in particular for Christians, you have a moral imperative to be an ally in the cause for justice, right? So that's the perspective that we have to take. It doesn't have to be about us. For us to feel, for us to empathize, for us to understand that, you know, something wrong has been done and the wrong has been perpetuated, right? And, you know, it wasn't just what I remember. So when I came here in to the U.S. in 2013, I went to North Bronx Church. I came like the Thursday, I went to North Bronx the Saturday, and they were discussing the whole incident with Trayvon Martin, and you know the panel discussion was about is justice colorblind, right? And you know I just recall some of the conversations, and you know lots of Caribbean folks are at this church, and the distancing, I mean the lack of empathy, the lack of realizing that hey, no, this could have been your child, like regardless of where you're from. So you know we have to see this as part of our gospel imperative. We have to see this as a part of what God has called us to do as Christians in the world, you know, from all over. And more generally, as people, whether you're Christian or non-Christian, to see this as, you know, a moral duty. That we have a moral duty to be involved, to support. I mean, I'm not saying you have to be out there with a placard on the front lines. I mean, calling is important again, and what you feel comfortable doing. But silence is not an option. Non-participation is not an option. So, you know, it's for our people to realize that, one, there is the global perspective of oppression. Like, all of us are impacted by this racialized, oppressive system that has gone global. So it's global oppression to begin with, and then to realize the nuances of it. So in the Caribbean, we still struggle because, you know, there's the economic disenfranchisement that's caused by the same people who perpetuate the racialized disenfranchisement in the United States, who own the resources. So in the Caribbean, we can say, oh, we're independent nations, we're free. Are we? Right. Really? Yeah. Who controls the money? Who controls the politics? All right, so we're still caught up in that, right? Yeah, and in Africa, the same thing. So right now, you know, the AU met this week, and then we see the entire explosion between the South African delegation and the rest of the African Union because of, you know, South Africa, they're the affluent ones, they're paying most of the bills, so they're calling the shots. And so there's a deal to be ratified which would basically bring a tighter political and legislative framework to the African Union, but South Africa is holding out because of their partners in the West. Their white partners, the large countries, who are nudging them in one way or the other. So we're still impacted by that. And if we can realize that all of us as people of color, all of us who identify with Africa as the ancestral home, are impacted by oppression, then when we migrate to the United States and see the way in which that oppression plays out, then we have to have the humanness about it, the empathy about it, the sensitivity about it, the call to duty about it, and be involved. I don't know how else to articulate it for us to understand. And talking to Adventists in particular Caribbean Adventists is another story, because we just see the skies about to burst open and God is going to take us up yonder so we don't have to be involved in this thing. So we said, oh, it's politics. Let's leave it alone.
I guess, so, yeah, so I'm a bit of, I think I wouldn't say that I'm a skeptic, but I'm a little pragmatic optimist. So I think that you, well, touching on the church in the last bit again, I think it comes full circle in terms of our mentality, and so I think I think Pastor Vanderhorst's point becomes particularly important because I just speak for myself. It's all a cycle. It's all a circle, and it's all a mess. And I want to put it where we can get it as just a few of us here talking and understanding how can we, even us here, like go back and affect change or to work on things. And I think your point, was kind of where my heart is on the matter. I think that God you have to feel appointed by Yahweh to make certain things happen and to do certain things, and you should make it your purpose to bring those things to fruition and to not let that sit by the wayside, because I think it's a lot of those movements that are going to make a change. Because as you mentioned, the mental enslavement is so real that we won't unify about it. We won't. There's so many competing factors. So you talk to South Africa, they're going to give you a whole bunch of reasons as to why that's problematic for them. Right, the value of their currency is probably going to go down. This is going to happen next. Same thing in Jamaica, same thing in the Caribbean. Like the economic situation is terrible, because of past situations that have happened in terms of our relations with colonial powers. But what's happening on the ground, right? A lot of, and not to say that what's the word? Mismanagement of funds or whatever that happens, because the same thing happens in different African nations. They'll say, okay, this, there's been like embezzlement or mismanagement of funds. A lot of these things will happen. And to me, it just rings like something that, again, it's like there's a very easy formula to, but our ability to lay hold of it as a people it eludes us. In many different ways, and I think that it comes down to particularly first generation Americans, or like I'd say like myself, where you have one foot that's rooted in your culture, but you grew up here, and you have one foot that's rooted here. You have to really evaluate where you see your future being and how, if this is a matter that's important to you, how you're going to help. Why do I say that? Because I've stopped watching videos of like cops shooting folks and bad things happening. I've stopped watching because I know the feeling that it brings up in me, and it's not going to change the work that I feel like God has asked me to do. And I want God to lead it, because like you said, there's a lot of embracing liberals and like young adults as well that can end up selling out the work, right? Because the white folks are just waiting for you to say, yes, you're like one of the special ones. Let's like give you this position, or let's like, put you here. And then it becomes about the dollar, and it becomes about like you, and not necessarily about the work. Because as soon as you're in that system, you're in that system. We've got to start thinking about other systems. We've got to disengage from the binary of American race, where it's like blacks versus whites. Every time we have a conversation about race, like you said, the Asians are nowhere to be found. They're very much like about Asian folks. You can find Chinatowns like all across this nation. Can you find towns that are, like that are marked and understood by the systems and the powers to be Trinidad Town, Ghana Town, right? You're not going to find that. And what we're going to receive in trying to do that, but we have to be about doing that anyway. You see what I'm saying? Like, we can't be about, so many of us, and because of the binary, we fall into the system. I think a lot of social responsibility still lies on a lot of black elites, whether they are in entertainment and music, or we see them in media, or they're in different fields, for it to matter. Because until it matters to the people with the resources, then we're just kind of still going around and around. And I know that we're in church and all this other stuff, and I don't want to start a whole deal. But, my intellectual, like how I'm operating, I'm seeing this. I'm seeing churches, black churches, North Bronx, tithe millions of dollars. Like, that's unreal. Like, when I think about it, we tithe millions of dollars, and that's when that's a really, and I hope they're not on there and feel like I'm shouting them out, but once I started recognizing like what happens, like we tithe millions of dollars, and a lot of our churches that tithe millions of dollars have nothing to show for it in terms of institutions of our own. We don't have schools of our own. We don't have, you know, a market of our own. Like people in our community, in your church can go hungry, but you got to push the tithe out. Like it's crazy. Like, and I mean, I don't want to call it crazy because I don't want anyone to feel, there's a biblical concept of tithing and I think we need to revisit, but I also think we have to evaluate what we're doing with our resources, particularly as immigrant people. So we come in with a certain level of education. I've been a classroom teacher. There are African Americans and African students at this point, which is why it's particularly, you have to start recognizing yourself as an African American. You have to start recognizing, because your kids are going to school and the education system is so bad that they're on 3 grades lower reading level, right? And then I'm the classroom teacher, and it's like I'm supposed to force a 6th grade novel down their throat when they read on 2nd grade level, right? And you can think about the socio-emotional impact of me having to do that and wrestling with those young brothers and sisters around reading and how much it matters in the gap. But the point of what I'm saying is we have to develop our own institutions. A lot of us that are about the social justice work also just want to hold hands with white folk. We just want a big hug from them. We just want them to like us. We just want to be embraced by them. We just want to feel equal to them, and we're never going to be. That's why Asians disengaged, with that whole thing. Because Asians experience a perpetual otherness. It doesn't matter how many years they're in the States. When you see an Asian, you think they're Asian. Right? You don't see them as American. You don't see them as from New Jersey, DMV, da-da-da. You see them as Asian. So that perpetual otherness feeds a sort of community binding that isn't necessarily taking place with black folks because we, acculturate. Yeah. We're all about it. And it doesn't help, it's not helping. And so I think we have to really evaluate, particularly if every black church, you see, and that's a whole other piece, but if every black church says, okay, we actually want to give $100,000, a tenth of what we're sending out to the conference led by white folks that do things that in corporate America, like they do corporate stuff. And if your black self shows up there for a job, they probably's not, you know what I'm saying? Like guys, we have to really understand, it's a part of a corporation as well. And I don't want to attack any spiritual principles or any principles that make sense, because Sister White herself sent her tithe to help build Oakwood, right? Because she understood that this work was needed to be done. Like this work needed to be done, right? And when she was talking about that type of stuff, they sent her to Australia, right? So we have to really disengage. That's really the only way that it's going to happen. You have to be adamant about your freedom, and you have to really mean it at any cost. Like he said, you got to look 10 miles on the road and be willing to face whatever the ultimate cost of that is. We just have to be serious about it, because otherwise we can't keep feeling like the schools are going to do us justice. When I hear people talking about culturally relevant education, I remember that I went to kindergarten in a Baptist church school, a black Baptist church school, a black Jamaican Baptist church school. And you see like how my mother there has the wrap on her head? Like they put us on shows and we had to dress up. We had our kente, it was so black. And it's not like you saw it as, okay, this is black and that's why. You saw it as, this is how you are. This is who you are. So we learned songs. We had worship in the morning. We learned different ways, right? Music is very important to us. Regardless of what sort of African background we have, we communicate with music and art, right? So every morning we'd go up, we'd learn another song, and we'd have worship in the morning. We'd have our shows where we'd recite poems, right? And if you were, it's the culture that is helping to rear you. Because if you got in trouble in school, you didn't want to tell your parent, right? Because they were just going to reinforce whatever the teachers, you didn't want that to come out. Whatever it was, you left it there. You dealt with whatever your consequence was in that space. And I bring up that anecdote to say, we understood that we were being reared by our own. We understood who we were, where we were coming from, and where we wanted to go. And all of my peers that went to that school with me, I kid you not, went on to do well in the other spaces that we were, because it was in the same community. We went on to, Catholic schools and so forth, because our parents didn't want to chance sending us to the public school, right? Which I'm so grateful for, because the whole system is like a, you know, yeah, it's like it's almost like a daycare. It's almost like this the system, you know, the government here says, okay, we allot this amount of money to education, right? To the promise of free education. But any good American knows, unless you live in a very wealthy neighborhood, you're not trying to send your kid to no public school, right? Because America is just this capitalistic system where you got to keep, you know, like doing better and getting yourself more resources to survive. Else you're in the bottom rung and you're just cast to the side. So then it baffles my mind that those of us with means send millions of dollars straight out of the community every week. We don't build a school. We don't have a market. We don't have credit union. We don't have loans. We don't have anything to show for it. And so, and I'm uniquely passionate about that because that's the community I'm in, right? I am an SDA person. I'm a Caribbean SDA person in this system. And just, I guess, SDA, right? So I'm looking at, and in the black SDA tradition, like, you know, and again, coming to different spaces, like Emmanuel Brinklow, I was like, oh, these are some different kind of black folk, you know? Like coming down into the South where you can find different pockets of you know, black folks that have been around in their community for a while, or even out west where they had Black Wall Street. There's been examples of spaces where people have taken control of what's happening around them. And we need to just get back to that. You know, we need to get back to starting with just our community and looking out for ourselves with our dollar. I'm sorry to say, but it's just what you're gonna have to do. The Jews, their dollar goes around however many times. The researchers always showed you. They don't have to ask the anti-Jewish or the anti-Semitic white man for $1. They don't have to ask him for school. They don't send their kids to be schooled by them. They don't have to ask them for kosher meat, right? They don't have to ask them for any of the things that they need. And I think our community has to be just as serious about that. And it doesn't mean you hate white folks, but it doesn't mean you hate white folks, right? It does not mean that. I feel like, you know, and I'm not going to go into too many anecdotes, but those two things do not mean the same. And you have to be serious about it, because when white people tell you that you're being a victim, what they're saying to you is that you keep harping on how the systems have worked against you. And essentially what they're saying is, yeah, we did that to you. What you do? What you going to do? And it's not that we want to take that in and take the, you know, the sort of violent anti-Christian route, but what they're saying is, like, you got to be serious about your own freedom. Like, and I don't, you know, want to preach, but that's what I want to leave us with. Like, we have to see ourselves as a collective black, and politicize our race, as opposed to seeing ourselves as regional in different countries, etc. And then we have to problematize or cause conversation around, and it strikes home because I came from a church where we didn't have a fridge. Sometimes we'd need a fridge or a new stove, and we'd have to fundraise for it. And it blew my mind that you're tithing out millions of dollars and you got no fridge. And you can't ask the conference for a fridge. Your kids are here. They can't afford the same education, the Adventist education, but we tithed out $1 million. We don't have a scholarship to show. These things we've really got to begin to, and I don't mean to sound casual about it, but it's just a journey that I've taken in terms of understanding and being self-reflective of myself and my people about how this matters, and making sure that I'm not chasing clout, and making sure that God is leading what I'm doing, and that I'm putting my passion behind and my hand to the plow around what he asked me to do. Being self-reflective about problematic ways that we operate in, and not feeling like I have to conform, right? Me saying this is a problem in certain spaces, you know, and I have to walk with that. Yeah, I'm going to be the one that said the tithing system needs to change. And that's going to mean that for certain people, they're not ever going to like me. And they've stopped listening to what I've said. But it's important and integral for my freedom. For my freedom. I mean, it's up to you whether you want to, you know, and you got to evaluate your participation in things as well. So I just think, you know, not to sort of ramble, but we've got to be very, very, very serious, very reflective about where our dollar is going, particularly as a community where we have it. In our churches, we have the community. right? We're aligned morally, we're aligned in a lot of ways, and that's what becomes difficult, is to align with a group of people where you guys have the same sort of principles and ideas and so forth. And that's why a lot of people will say a lot of racial unity can't take place outside of the church or outside of a spiritual space.
Or institutions with power that coerce.
Yes.
And define.
Yes, right. Or you know, make it difficult or scatter us or layer us, right? We have it. And we've got to begin to think about a new day. And that's just frankly what it is. So long as we are looking to them, and by them I mean the collective white other, the hegemonic white other, to lead us. They're leading our institution, to control our dollar, to give us food, to educate us. So long as this is what we're participating in, we can't expect better from them. You know, like you.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
We gotta move on.
I'm sorry to ramble, y'all.
Before we open for question and answers, two specific questions that I have, because there are many spaces in which this conversation around what to do with the Thai dollar, should we keep it in our communities and so forth, is happening, and so that brings up what is the Christian duty or the role of Christianity when we talk about reconciliation, when we look at how we've separated, and I think one important piece that ASJ particularly brings is that social justice is occurring within a theological framework that can be flawed, that can be problematic in itself, and so there's a continuous question around what role does Christianity play as we are trying to bridge the gap? If someone can answer that briefly for us. And then my second question to Minister Vanderhorst is, a lot of times we have these conversations and we don't explore the psychological impact of separation and the trauma and what that has done to us all as a people. And so how can we begin to bring to the surface that part of this entire conversation? So that's two questions. I'm guessing Randy's taking the first one, and then Minister V.
Yeah, all right. So at least in this country, historically, social justice emerged within a Christian theological framework. Or let me put it another way, a Judeo-Christian theological framework. And it has worked fine. But there's a struggle for more conservative institutions like ours in terms of embracing the full scope of social justice. Here we have largely talked about race and economics to some extent, but then that's only a part of the social justice agenda. Then we have to get into things such as sexuality and sexual orientation, and then we have to get into things that involve non-Christians. Like when we talk about black unity, I mean, that's a loaded term. And we could go on and on trying to unpack it. But just on the very the surface, it's not just the Caribbean folks coming together, the African folks and the African Americans and all three and all blacks coming together. But it's who they are and what they're bringing in this idea of what we call the unity of black people that we want. Because so in this unity, you're bringing LGBTQIA folks. You're bringing the Rastafarian. You're bringing the atheist who is black. So when we sketch a theological framework, that itself, a Christian theological framework, is part of what I think is a power discourse, right? How are we going to set the unity agenda? Who's calling the shots? And I'm not proposing to give you answers right here, but I just want to provoke some of the things that are involved when we say we want black unity. Do we really want it? Do we want it in our churches? Or we're saying, well, we can unite the Seventh-day Adventists and then we can sort of be allies with everybody else. Sure, but if you're being allies, how do you see alliance building? Do you see it as some kind of complicity of what you have to be an ally with or to? Is something that's contrary to your Christian principles, dogmas, doctrines, and views? Right? So it's the social justice agenda. So far, I think we as Adventists, we're supporting what we like and being silent about what we don't like. But then I think the point where I am at is that I can I can be an ally to the LGBTQI agenda without necessarily believing that, accepting it as my practice or the practice of my church. Now, you can define what you want, but you can support it. How do you do that? Because you recognize one fundamental thing that God gave all of us, which is choice, right? And so any kind of move to dismiss or to take away or to dehumanize anybody around the choices they make, we have to stop and rethink how, we're setting and we're pushing this agenda. So, I mean, that's just like a surface level sketch of it. But I think reconciliation is a uniquely Christian theological concept. It's a powerful one. It's a deep one because, we have the greatest example of reconciliation in any theological discourse, which is God reconciling himself to human beings. Not human beings reconciling to God, but God reconciling himself. The Bible says that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself. And you say, why on earth would God need to reconcile himself? He ain't done anything wrong. But, that itself depicts the power of what we're here to do because, ultimately it's one family, the human family. And not that you're seeking validation from those who have projected themselves to be this superior, but that you understand that within our theological discourse, that God made all in his image, all in his likeness, that we have to get back to that kind of Edenic ideal, which Minister Vanderhorst told us this morning is the intentional will of God, which is the harmony that we're going to live in with each other and with God Almighty himself.
In my study and research dealing with trauma, I won't go into it. Basically, if there was one word that I would define the African collective, and let me just say this personally. I am an African American. Africa is my ancestry. America is my residency. I'm not an American. That's my residency. I'm an African in America. Now, if I would encapsulate one word that would deal with our collective experience, it would be trauma. And we see all of the gradations of trauma among our collective. However, I believe that it is imperative for us to connect as a people, as a black people. And I believe that our area of connection must be our children. After watching the Black Panther movie, I posted a question online, and it was a simple question. What do you think is the vibranium of black people? And I got a lot of answers, and I concur with all of them. However, the one that resonated with me the most, the vibranium of black people is our children. And I believe that that is the area that we must collect in to interrupt the trauma and ongoing oppression. I quote her often, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, an African-American woman psychiatrist who's based here in Washington, D.C. Our organization, Prepare Our Youth, sent a lot of children to her. But she said something that was very apropos. She says that any meaningful discussion, and I've been waiting for this, in the future of black people must be predicated upon that people's maximal development of its children. And then she asks for a question. Some of you have heard me put this out. Number one, will black children reach their maximal development? Number two, if so, who will be ultimately responsible for the maximal development of black children? Number three, if black children will not be maximally developed, what will happen to that mass of human beings? And her fourth question was, Are white people in any way looking to black people for the maximal development of white children? Which means we must take responsibility and be accountable to interrupt, to abate, to fight against the ongoing trauma and oppression that this generation coming behind us is experiencing. And we can do that. That is our common work, I believe. If we say, where is our starting point? Where is our jump off points or whatever to bring about unity and so forth? Let's start with our children. Let's interact with our children. Let's bring them together and give them the exposures that we all have, the rich African cultures and how they have manifested themselves in our different cultural milieu. Let's deal with our children. And if we don't, then what will happen to them? I believe that we must and we can, and we have a God-given imperative to help our children and our young people so that they can grow to carry on the Christ manifesto of Luke 4:18.
Can we give a round of applause to our panel? Powerful, powerful discourse. Any questions from, okay, can we maybe walk around with one of the callers' mics? There's a question here. Can I have a volunteer? You can come up to the mic.
I don't know if I have a question so much as I have a lengthy comment.
How lengthy?
I'm sorry. But I think that everything that has been said here has some truth to it. But I think as a Christian, we need to understand that service to God takes precedent over everything else. Who we are as Christians takes precedence over who we are as a color. And I think that there hasn't been a focus on that enough. The Jamaican people were talking about, because of the fact that they were fighters against, or the revolutionary, why they're the way they are, and because other people are meek or whatever, that they're not as concerned about revolution as other people are. And I just want you to point to two people in the Bible who had that spirit, and when God took over, their spirit had to change. Moses was a fighter. He killed somebody in his zeal to protect his people. God did not want his people to be protected in that manner. He had to go in the wilderness, become meek. God said he was the meekest of men before he died. Before you can do anything for God in a revolutionary manner, you need to be controlled by God, and which means that your spirit has to be meek. The second one is Peter, who cut off the high priest's servant's ear in his zeal to protect Jesus. And Jesus had to tell him, that is not how I need you to fight, not with a sword. So we need to understand that everything that we want to do, it has to be aligned with Christ, because we are Christians, number one. So I just want to make that choice, point clear, and I want to know, in light of that, how do you want to proceed with the goals of empowering or revolutionizing, or making the fate of Black people better? And two, I find that a lot of us are unwilling to recognize in ourselves that we are not treating each other the way we should treat each other. And before I would be willing to say you started a bank or you started some other business or whatever, and I saw that you were cheating on your wife, you don't take care of your kids, I really don't even care whatever else you have to say. If you're not doing that to your own family that you're in the house with, who you have chosen to be with, I really don't even care whatever else you have to say or whatever else you're doing to revolutionize the lives of black people. You need to start taking care of your own family, your own people first by being faithful to your wives, taking care of your children, getting up and going to work. You know, those are the things that we have a problem with on an ongoing basis, and everybody wants to be a revolutionary, but you know, it starts in your home. So I would like to know how can we start a revolution by changing the way we treat our people, and then move from there to going to starting banks and you know, doing economic development. Economic development starts at home.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
the two things about how you treat people and how, however you're going to do what you're doing, how are you going to do it, understanding that you're a Christian first.
Anyone on the panel cares to take that?
Okay, so thank you for
Really quickly.
your
I'm
comment.
sorry.
Yeah.
Let's keep question and responses timed so that we can move along.
Okay, so about how much time do I have? 2 minutes?
1 minute or less.
Okay, that's not fair. Okay,
1
so
minute.
so I think definitely appreciate your sentiment. I think a lot of folks have that sentiment. I don't have that sentiment in terms of feeling like I need to be more demure or less aggressive about my freedom. Personally, I think essentially I do seek and want to be a meek person and do want to align with the Lord, but I think we misinterpret. So even though Peter cut someone's ear off, like God still chose him to be, right? God said to him, Peter, when you're converted, strengthen the brethren. He was still a leader. So like my shortcomings, I don't think that God, or however it is that, whatever that might be, it might be a particular you know, way of handling things. It might be a particular action that I might make, right? Or whatever it is, because, you know, essentially we're all going to have problems, by the way. You know, down here on earth, born in sin. So it's like God can still work past that. And I think that it's problematic to hear a lot of African folk prioritize things that in our community that is kind of like we want people to be perfect or we want them to be a particular way before we feel that we can support, right? JP Morgan or wherever you bank with, I'm sure that captain of industry robbed, stole, killed, destroyed, and you still bank with him. And that's a part of our problem as a people, is that we want to say, you know, you're not good enough for me to support other communities. That's not the case. The service that they're providing is the service that they're providing, and we support them. And, you know, so that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is, I think you're pointing to household leadership, right? Which in the Christian or the Judeo-Christian sort of framework begins with men. I think it's important to remember that if you have a system, a patriarchal system, right, that attacks black men from the time that they're in school. So if you're talking about a layer, you're talking about generations and hundreds of thousands of black men that are coming up being, you know, miseducated, uneducated, targeted, made to feel less, you know, put down, not supported, whatever they bring to the classroom or to certain settings isn't received, then you're talking about men that are going into life with less knowledge, right, than they should have to go about families. When you're talking about broken homes, then you're talking about people that have seen brokenness from the beginning. So I get where you're going with that, but all of this is connected in that if we don't stop the oppression of our people on all walks of life, we aren't going to have strong male leaders in the house because white supremacy doesn't want that. So.
Thank you.
May I just say something very quickly to that also? And also thank you for your comments and expressing your thoughts. I think Dr. Malana Karinga said it best. He, as many of you know, is the founder of Kwanzaa. But Malana Karinga said this: we may not have an ideological unity, but what we can have is an operational unity. And so I really think that even though we may have diverse views and opinions on things, we can have an operational unity that moves forward instead of waiting until everything is in place. Yeah. There can be things done simultaneously in the liberation of our people. And that is, I think, would probably be important. Malcolm X said it also. It says we don't have to haggle over the methods if we have some common objectives that we can work with. And so I think that's important, in addition to considering the whole process of doing something. Somebody said silence is not always golden. Sometimes it's merely yellow.
Thank you. This is very interesting. Firstly, I grew up under what you call the apartheid system in South Africa. And I was part of the teenagers who fought for Mandela to be released from prison. That was during 1988, 89. And I see a lot of a compromise that has come amongst our people. You know, one of the things that Steve Biko wrote, he was saying, the best weapon of the oppressed, it is the oppressed mind. And as well as when I listen to him as he relates, he died of a broken heart as he was assassinated because of what he stood for. I'm talking about the politics now. And I look forward how, as Christians, of course, many understand that when, you know, of course, as is related, that the Bible was brought and the land was confiscated and left there. Until this day, my grandfather died 2007. We have a vast land of more than 2,000 hectares. And still family members with the government still fighting even to get the very same land that we fought that when we get freedom, we're supposed to be returned back. Now, where do you see justice? Most of the family members, many of them who have gone through even the same educational system, didn't even benefit us. I have to de-educate or to decolonize and re-educate myself in the right way. And when you're talking about an education, now, who wrote that education? Because it has been compromised and it has been written by someone who his intention and his system is to keep you colonized from the instruction that was given about 1804 even by the Pope Francis VIII, sending even those guys to the Caribbeans to colonize. He said, take away when you colonize, take it history, take it down. Confiscate all their history. Let them not know who they are. Any country go colonize them. Make sure that even introduce your own language. Take everything. And that has been continuous. And I sometimes sit here and think, and I said, we're sitting here and we are thinking, hey, wait a minute, how do we come out of the situation where we are? You know, talking about the unity, talking about the differences. Let's go back to education system. History has been compromised. And we can't stand for an example, a governing system, all in Africa. Look at the whole continent as it is. More than 90% of the platinum, of 50 whatever percent of gold, and 53% of the diamonds, and everything it is. But why are we even many coming here? Because we're struggling back in our countries. Why? Because our leaders have gone through a system of education that compromises the very same integrity, the very same people who are supposed to be ruling themselves. An example. When they came in, they said, no, don't educate their chiefs. Because we have all chiefs ruling our way. Take an ordinary man, make him educated, and let them rule over chiefs, finally, and see what is going to happen. Now, the focus of the nation, leave who their chief is. No chief will let people here suffer or oppress them. We'll make sure that they go, and they understand that. Said, no, put ordinary person, put them there, and we steal their system, and our governing system will take advantage over them. No matter what they do, because any education system to go through, whatever they have to learn, it is what we wrote, what we told them. Most of them, for an example, African American, when they said, no, sometimes we don't like Africans because you sold us, we are here. Who told you you sold you? Who told you our ancestors sold you? Can you give a space? Who wrote that book that told you that you've been sold? Number one, can they give the chief or the names or the tribe of those who sold you? Is there any evidence? Where did you read it from? And it is the mind that has been set, and that as a result, it is what? Now, education system, it means the history needs to be corrected. Because we cannot go ahead with a situation where even in economy, when you go through economy, wait a minute. Our economic system has been set up so that continuously you pay or you advantage the European-centric system of how they do things. When are you going to develop ourselves? We're crying and said, no, most Africans, usually I sit and speak with a brother and said, okay, we came here because we're looking for better, greener pastures. Now tell me, it is fine, you enjoy yourself. How more about the person who lives in that village without any hope because he's uneducated and no one cares about what does? Now, what is that uneducated mind going to do? Because there is nothing that is left for that person to read or to trace what to do. Everything has been taken away. And we are sitting with a problem that we are saying, hey, we want to decolonize. We want to be free, and we are free. Free from what? From the system? You want to live better? Better out of what? And who makes those things better? And I believe we are sitting with a problem. For an example, we talk about
30 seconds.
Sorry. We have been talking about, for an example, among us. We have been disadvantaged even about our theological understanding. You have to understand, as an Adventist, growing up in South Africa, let me be honest. During the apartheid system, none of so-called even white ever said anything. Both a minister, a white and a black pastor will come. And they will do this. They will give a black pastor a bicycle. They will give a white pastor a car. Go and minister. And it doesn't talk about the same thing. While you were doing even the thing. For example, the same my wife, she was shocked. She's an American. And we were doing a missionary work back home in South Africa. And we ended up, because we couldn't reach a destination, we said we're going to worship in this town. Because we were traveling. And we saw a church, a white church. Because a black church was far away. And the white folks said, no, you cannot worship here. We worship under a tree while worshiping as the Adventists. And mind you, we are paying the tithe from the best union. Now, wait a minute. What are you telling me? You're paying your tithe. Are we paying tithe because we want to be the members of the Adventists, or we pay tithe because we want to benefit God's system, how we can take care of the poor? Most of the things we don't want, we are very sensitive about to talk about them. No, that's untouchable ground. But wait a minute, someone is dying right there because of the tithe. Right here, there's a man I went and I visited in Takoma Park. I went to his house. The house was falling apart. The man that was there, and I felt so bad. I didn't have any tools to help, just to connect what was happening. But he was worshiping in a very big church, paying tithe. Yet he sleeps with hunger in his own home. How do we interpret? What kind of a God is that? But in my own thinking, now our theological education has been compromised. We don't want to talk about it. Because in the first place, the tithing system, it is not even how it is it is because according to the structure, it has to be like that. Who said that? Are we following what the Bible, what the Word of God say? And don't undermine it. I understand. A minister, I used to be paid off the tithe. Understand that? Now, we need to tackle issues accordingly. I'm saying, and I'm looking back, and I said, wait a minute. I know my time is over, but can I borrow one?
You could borrow 30
There is a
more
lot.
seconds.
I only told about 3. And let me leave these other ones. Because there is no time, unfortunately. But let me come to the need. Number 1, if we have to tackle this, I've been listening. Education on what? Family education. That is based in our understanding. Most of the Europeans didn't understand that the basic unit of a black man is what? Is the family. We destroyed that. That is why many so-called African American, they never got that what? Opportunity to mold their family. They had to, one way or the other, bring all the drugs amongst them to make sure that ever and continuously there will be dysfunction amongst them. Right. And Africans, when they come, we turn our side on that. We say they are benefiting from what they have labored for many years, disadvantage. What are we doing to educate them? Family education, social education. How can I deal with it? How much about economy? There are many things that I believe that we need to think about and say something that needs to bring unity. Let us not Christianize things that are not supposed to be, to be covered.
Right. Yes. Right.
When you sold someone bread covered in the plastic, you cannot take the bread and eat the bread with the plastic. There's going to be a problem in the stomach.
Right.
You take away the plastic and you give the bread.
Thank you.
We need to make sure that we take away the plastic in our theological education.
Yes, sir.
And let's eat the bread.
I think we need you in ASJ, so we need your information. You need to join the organization, sir.
Good evening, everybody. Appreciate this panel. I think it's really important. I won't repeat too much stuff. I just wanted to touch on a few points. I remember a gentleman here said, mentioned Marcus Garvey. I know we're mentioning, we're talking about discussion, how we can bring a result or bring some type of progress. And the one thing I was remembering Marcus Garvey, his example, to me, at least reading about him, it showed that when, I guess, black people move on one accord, yes, that things can be done. Yes. The other thing, I think is very important, even though we have a little bit of disagreement, but it's all right. We're big people. But the one thing that I've heard from everybody that's spoken up here and the ones who spoke afterwards was education. I used to teach, taught middle school for a little bit, PG County, and I fully believe that education is probably the go-to for the change that we're looking for. The children, especially where I live at, where I live in DC, the kids, it's like they need just a roadmap, and they don't have it. It's almost like they're just going in all directions at the same time, very fast. But another important point that I heard that I thought was very, very insightful was mentioning how the Asians move. And that's another thing where, moving and caring. I heard a quote, somebody say, loving my mom doesn't mean I hate yours. So moving in accord and moving on a group's behalf doesn't mean that you have a problem with another group. It just means you understand that my group has issues. And I guess there's some solutions I was thinking about when he was mentioning the church and the money, how the money can be allocated in ways that can be beneficial, and things that we even need, like education, like food. Food is a big thing. Where I live at, there's no grocery store. It's a what do you call it, a food desert? People go to 7-Eleven for their groceries, and most people are not driving. So, and no one's really going to carry the groceries on the bus, so that's a big thing. And I was thinking, I said, if we had the money, open a grocery store. That's probably the next go-to, just food, and you can evolve your ministry there. But I really did enjoy this conversation. Oh yeah, my last thing. So for me, getting my mind when my mind started to, I was raised in a Caribbean home as well. My parents are my dad especially was very outspoken, and he still is. And one thing he mentioned, along with education, I didn't really hear. I don't know if you guys mentioned imagery. I know you mentioned media, but imagery was something that was very big to my father, and I didn't really understand, until you show me that there's a doll test they do. I think a gentleman back in the day did it in Ebony magazine, but that is very important when it comes to impressionable minds, and what was I gonna say? But yeah, in schools, up to even the college age, young people are always looking for ways. They start to look for ways to better their environment, even though a lot of them might not voice it initially. They want to first maybe help their friends out, help their mans out right around, but then they start to get enlightened based on what they see, and they start to really pay attention to what's going on, and they say, man, I could probably help some people back home, because some people might come from areas that don't have the opportunity to go out, and they realize when I go back home this degree and this debt, and all my mans are like, yo, you made it big, and I'm like, you're like, no, I'm actually a lot poorer than you now, but I have a degree though, but I own money. But I feel like these type of discussions, which I think are so beneficial, should be kept more on a micro scale as well, like going to the smaller areas and going to schools, because they don't have these discussions. Like when I was in college, we didn't have discussions like this, at least as in a formal setting. Like we had them amongst ourselves, and I'm not saying we can try to start it, but just the resources. I'm saying just providing the resources as some ways to just to spread this type of movement, this type of thinking, because there's, like I said, there's a lot of young people who are about to go into the workforce. Like me, I'm in the workforce now, and most times when you get in the workforce, people like me and you are the minority, and we gotta, as they say, code switch. We can't be 100. We gotta be 60%. We don't want to scare nobody, So especially when you're in Caribbean, they hear a little accent like, yo, let me curry chicken, But nonetheless, I feel like these discussions are very important, and they should be ongoing in even more smaller settings, grand settings too. But the smaller settings, I think, will provide a much more vitriol type of movement. Like it would spread much more rapid. But I appreciate it though. Thank you for your input.
Thank you.
Good evening. I too want to echo what the others have said about this type of discussion, just having this outlet to be able to express certain things that we feel that sometimes we don't know how to express. One thing, though, that I know is that I know a lot of us have been indoctrinated sometimes even to look down on ourselves and one another. And I'm just wondering, in line with reconciliation, and our pastor has been preaching about reconciliation, how do we, as Black people, appreciate the differences amongst ourselves, first of all, because it's okay for it's one thing for somebody who is of a different persuasion to look at me and say, I don't know how to deal with you, I don't know how to associate with you. But it's more painful, I think, when people of the same color treat one another, badly in condescending ways. So how do we take the fight out there if we cannot internally work together? So how can we ensure that we are treating the diversity that we have among us as a thing of benefit, as opposed to using it, as a way to talk down on each other or treat one another bad? Because if we stay divided inside, there's no way that we're going to achieve that unity by somebody externally coming to do it for us. We have to achieve that unity here. We have to start in a small scale, and then be able to go out there and then educate others. So it's really critical that we have that education here, that we overcome this indoctrination of, oh, if you come from this other place, you have this, you know, I can't deal with you and all that. We have to find a way to overcome that. Because when we do, then it becomes easier to be able to work together with other people out there.
Real quick, I want to say, like, exposure is a very big part of this. I feel like, you know, many times we might know this one person, and our interaction with the one person from this country went wrong. Yeah. And so we take the instance of the one person and make it like the entire people, right? So I feel like exposure is like one of the ways to do this. Because, I mean, like, in Jamaica, I can think about like my community and ask how many people in my community who, as much as a Rastaman talks about Africa, ask them, how many Africans do you know? Right? I mean, even now, you know, not even to ask specific countries, but how many Africans do you know? Name an African. Have you ever met an African? No. But then, you know, you watch African movies and you see certain things and you hear certain conversation about African people. And then, you know, those things, I mean, it can go either way. Sometimes you have an over-idealized image, and other times it's a very, a very stereotypical image of who this person is. So I feel like, you know, those of us who are in the U.S. who have the opportunity of mixing more and, you know, with other people, other black people from other countries, I think, you know, compared to those from, like, my community back in Jamaica, we've never met anyone from the continent. I think that there's a greater chance here of working towards cohesion than there. And, you know, I don't know how the exposure is going to work because it takes money. But I feel like even with social media technology, we have to really find some way to... I mean, I used to do this pen pal thing in primary school, but then I just thought about it, like, all our pen pals were like white folks in the U.S. But that's something else. So we have to, you know, yeah, so it's still a question to find, like, creative ways of, like, trying to meet each other and affirm our differences. It's hard because we have prejudicial minds. I feel like because of sin, that's our default mindset, and we have to actively work against it to, you know, be able to embrace the diversity among us.
What I hear very quickly also, and the way I process things, sometimes questions are asked as far as what is going on, the different challenges, drama within our communities, our families, and so forth, resonate to me as statements of pain. Actually, statements of pain. And my wife is unique, and she's incredible. She says that if we celebrate marriages and relationships and support them, why are we so silent when we see marriages in trouble and we don't say anything? She makes it a point to go to whoever it is that she knows in the context of relationship, and is just as concerned about their challenges as she is about celebrating them when they first came together. When we learn to look behind people's faults and identify their need and minister to their need, you got them the rest of your life, you see. But it seems as if we go silent when they're hurting and in pain, but we celebrate the happy times and the coming together and all the rest of that. She said, why can't we be just as interested in that? And so basically, when I hear statements of pain, my first thought is, I'm not listening for the fault. I'm listening for the need. And if I can minister in some way, or somebody who's in relationship with them who has their ear or relationship can assist in ministering to the need, then we become part of the solution and not part of the problem. But a lot of times, statements of pain are seriously personal. Yeah, and projected publicly. And we need to have the discernment to know that this is not just issues that we're having and so forth, a drama and so forth. There are real needs behind this. And can we identify the appropriate resources? I am pushing something now, my book I'm writing for black men called Black Men Interrupted. It's my second book for black men, but I'm pushing something now, and I'll share a little bit more at another time. But this is my premise as far as black men are concerned, is that all that we go through, and it's not discounting our black women at all, because you go through a lot more. You got that sexism on top of all of the stuff that black men deal with too. Patriarchy, misogyny, and so forth. But I am suggesting that every black man, including myself, needs to talk to somebody, psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, at least once a quarter. Now, I've gotten serious pushback. But see, women go outside with their pain. Brothers go inside with their pain. You see. And where do we push our pain onto? Our women. Those who are close to us. Every brother needs to talk to somebody once a quarter. And I'm talking about a black professional, not a Caucasian. That's a whole nother topic I went to. I didn't mean to go into that. I was just trying to deal with the pain part. That's all.
I just add to the unity. Yeah, you can. I just wanted to add to the conversation around unity or reaching across was that one thing that I learned was that if you listen to folks and the culture that they're coming from, particularly because we are African in background, you can find a lot of similarities. And so it's kind of like there's this idea that we're so very different, but it's not really the case. It's just through different iterations and different sort of legacies. So like even if you look at like Jamaicans and Antiguans, right, we see that they're like from similar tribes, which are like similar to Ghanaian folks, right? We have a similar sort of tribe, right? And folks will tell themselves, oh, I don't like Ghanaians, but you're Ghanaian. Right? That's your tribe, right? I don't like Antiguans, so that's from, or I don't like, South Africa, but that's your people, right? Or I don't, so it's like, listen clearly to the folks. One thing I learned in studying social society was that in the South, what we call Southern hospitality really comes from African traditions of acknowledging another person, right? Respect for your elders, right? You greet them, you say hello. And Jamaicans, we can understand that too. Like if you walk past an elder and don't say, you're not no manas. Like, you don't, like, you know what I mean? Like there are a lot of similarities. Sometimes I'd really enjoy hearing my African-American friends get cursed out by their mom. Because as a Jamaican, like I get cursed, my parents come at me in patois. So it's like, initially, it's funny to them to hear me get yelled at too, because it's like they can understand what's happening, but it's like in a different way, So it's like it's different. So they like can joke because they know your parent is going off on you, but it's different. So when I hear their parents talk to them, it's no different than how some of our like parents and aunties talk to us. When we talk about aunties and community, family, like that's how African people are. It's a village.
Yeah, and like the yard thing, that's the compound thing that would be in Africa.
Yeah, or like, your crib or however, there's a lot of similarities. You just have to look for them because they're not going to be in the Anglo language. They're not going to come across, as readily. But you just have to kind of, learn that there are similarities and there's beauty in difference. Like, that's the most fascinating, and one of the most fascinating things to me about God, he didn't just make one of anything. Like, there isn't just one type of cat. There isn't just one sort of fish. There isn't even sort of one sort of dolphin. Like, there is such beauty in the diversity of who we are. And we have to kind of, like, be cool with that. Like, someone is different from you. You can learn things from them in that regard, right? Like, so,
I just wanted to first say thank you for having this event today. One of my girlfriends told me about it because she knew how crazy I was about Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, and because of the movement that it has created, celebrating our ancestry and then, of course, moving forward past the movie and what are we now going to do with this? The movie broke a lot of records and also broke a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions in Hollywood of what a black-led cast could do. And so continuing this on is just fantastic. And I want to just say thank you to everyone who participated today. My name is Cherie. I am originally from Brooklyn, New York. I am African American. I was born and raised here. My ancestors, drug here. And so, you guys were talking about the experiences of, like you said, the Americans said to you, like, did you live, on the farm or in the yard, and what was the dirt like, and all this kind of stuff. And I had that kind of experience growing up in Brooklyn, where my first exposure to people from the Caribbean was in Queens, and again, thought they were all the same, and at one point, couldn't stand any of them. And it mainly came from them saying, Black Americans are lazy. Y'all don't want to do nothing. So I developed this kind of hate towards them. And as I grew and I learned more about them, I decided that, no, that's not right. I can't hate a whole group of people based on just my experience with a few people. And thankfully, this also came from my education. I was in the public school system, but what my mother taught me was, don't just rely on that. Continue to educate yourself. We had, I don't know if you guys remember the Encyclopedia Britannica. They would come around the neighborhood and try and sell you the books. And I begged my mother to buy it. And she was like, I read all the time. My brother and sister did not. And I was like, Mommy, please, please buy it, buy it. I was in those books all the time. And yes, there was probably a lot of stuff that was not included. But I kept seeking and I kept searching. And in college, that was when I thankfully was exposed to a lot of different courses, African American history, African histories that I didn't get in elementary school, middle school, or high school. And I just kept expanding on that. And so you guys talked about a lot of different things. So a lot of stuff is running through my brain. And like Pastor Vanderhorst said this morning, I'm going to be, kind of marinating on this for the next couple of weeks or so. And one of the things that I wanted to say was that a lot of what you said here today, I was already thinking about. And then there were some things you mentioned today that I never really thought about when you talked about the tithe in the community. And man, that got me started, because I was thinking about some of those things actually, and in relationship to the movie, and how a lot of why the Wakandans had what they had was because they kept it amongst themselves, and then they eventually realized they could share with others. And so, yes, we should be building up our own communities. I definitely agree with that. And I mean, like I said, a lot of things are running through my head, so I'm trying not to be too long-winded, but I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who was here. And just hopefully, as some of the others have said, that we will take from here today, and then how can we, as an individual, first seek God's guidance in what do you want me to take from this, Lord? And then now, how am I going to expand on that? What am I going to do? Because I think a lot of the times in the Black community, we're looking to the leaders to do. We're looking to people in power to do. No, you need to look at yourself. And what can I do from this point forward to help facilitate and grow? And so that's something that I am going to be working on. And one of the things I did was I said, you know what? After I saw the movie the second time, I said, you know what I'm going to do? As long as it's playing, I'm going to go see it every week. And I've seen it 15 times. And I've been talking to different people about different things that I've gotten from the movie. Darlene McCoy, who's a DJ on 104.1, some of you may know, the week it came out, she asked, what did you get from the movie? And I called in, I got through, and I said to her, I said, one of the first things I got was how T'Challa's character, he was struggling with how to lead his people, how to lead his country, and how we all know Killmonger was about, building everybody up in the country and taking over the whole world, whereas T'Challa was not so much on that, since he wanted to share the knowledge without doing it in a violent way. And how even some of his own people, Wakabi, wanted to do it another way. And it reminded me of Jesus. When he came down here, those people of the church, his disciples, wanted him to take over, and this is your country, this is your world that you created. We are your people. Let's go out there and show them that. And Jesus was not about just the people that he called. He was about all of the people. And I felt that I got that story from that movie and from that particular segment of the movie. So I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone who came and participated. And I hope all of us will go home and keep marinating on what we learned today, and then we'll take action to make change, to help our communities grow, to build each other up, and to love each other, because we are all created in the image of God. And yes, he created all of us different, but to embrace our differences, celebrate our differences, and then come together as a whole.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Lachey. I just want to first say thank you guys so much for this conversation. It's amazing. I'm very, very excited about what's being said here. I am a product of Adventist education up until 10th grade, where it was unfortunately abruptly interrupted because the principal / history teacher / literature teacher, because that's what we do, decided in a literature class to unpack a book called To Kill a Mockingbird and proceed by saying, you're an N-word, you're an N-word, and you're an N-word, under the guise of, learning. Unfortunately, that school was quickly shut down, and so... And my mother was a very big part of that exodus that happened, moving me as well as several other black students out of a very predominantly white institution. So I know that you guys are all educators in some type of way, but I know that you particularly highlighted that you educate. How do we move forward, especially even in Adventist? Do you teach Adventist education or? Okay, well, if you did, if you did work in Adventist education, how do we focus on the miseducation, of course, in that space? I feel like, along with, of course, the big separation between white conference and the black conference, it's prevalent everywhere, but in the South, in Georgia, it's very, very, prominent and well-known, and everybody knows about it. How do we create something that still has because the Christian message is supposed to be inclusive? How do we change the education without feeling like we're leaving anyone out, but also, telling the truth to a particular group of people who have been, disenfranchised in so many ways? That's my first question. 2, also, you highlighted that you talked about being in a school where the arts was very, very used to, I guess, create some type of connection between cultures. I'm an arts integration specialist, and so that really speaks to what I've been studying in school. And so how do you feel, what does the arts have, is there any space for the arts to be used in, Adventists for social justice, for, re-educating Black Americans? That's it.
All right. So yeah. So I think so. Interestingly enough, I'd say in order for that type of learning to take place, and I think the South African brother was mentioning also about the importance of education and looking into who wrote what and why does it matter. But I think it's also important, like the Anglo conformity, we have to just part with it. We just have to simply disengage. We just have to simply say that this is no longer going to be our standard. We just have to simply say that. And the fact that it hasn't happened shows you how problematic it is and how difficult it is to get there, which is why it's important to have great leaders and strong leaders that can make this distinction, particularly in the Adventist faith, because I find West Indians to be even more Anglo-conformist than African Americans, and that's the sort of the bitter truth. And is that, yeah, we are, because we haven't had to wrestle with them face to face in the whole nine of Jim Crow and all the ways that they try to take down our African American brothers. We are almost very comfortable with Anglo-conformity, and it's also because we have British background, and like British folk look up, stick our nose up on Americans, so like West Indians do the same. It's not just like a black American thing. It's just like with British background, you stick your nose up on American ways of being, or table manners, or whatever it is. So I think that because we have such a heavy proportion of West Indians in the faith, challenging the Anglo-conformity becomes hard because we still cling to that even in our nations. So it's so I feel like there is that even in terms of language. We have like a conversation about whether Pots was really a language or not, right? In like these spaces. I mean, that happens in America as well, but the Anglo-conformity is thick in our spaces as it pertains to facing outward. Inward, we're cool with our culture, and we know that we have it home, and we ride it out, and we enjoy it. But facing outward, we do the Anglo-conformity bit. So there's some work that probably can be done there.
Right. And so earlier on, I mentioned the whole problem of the epistemological framework, and I'm really harping at that because how knowledge is produced, how knowledge is validated, legitimated, those are things that are functions of power, right? So what ends up in your textbook is a result of the people with power. What comes as truth, and we like to say, oh, this is just a truth. And I'm thinking even more so about like theological positions. What we say, this is a truth. This doctrine is correct, and it's law, blah, blah, blah. All of that is really, these kind of back and forth between, how do I put it? Between power brokers, essentially. I don't think I can put it simpler than that. And so what is packaged to you as truth, that's what it is. So, I mean, we think it is something that cannot be challenged. It's something that's always true and have always existed to be true. It's God-given truth, but it's not. So, these things, so truth itself and knowledge is socially and politically constructed. And I don't think many of us have gotten that. So when we teach even the so-called, let's say, natural sciences or physical sciences, we accept like the laws of physics or the laws of mathematics as truth, not realizing that these things come out of discursive practices. And, it's like a self-sustaining framework, because once you establish that A is so, then naturally it will follow that everything that is derived from A will be true. But then the question is, was A ever true? Right? And so, these things, we work and we say, how can you say that? Because in medical science, this work and that work. Yes, fine. But yes, it works doesn't mean that it was the only thing that could work. And so we've had the sort of dismissal of, let's say, Afrocentric epistemologists, for example, in preference to Eurocentric models. And so what I found, particularly in my exposure to Adventist education, having gone to SDA University for 4 years and got a bachelor's degree, is that I was utterly shocked that it took me coming to the United States of America, to a predominantly white institution, to know that there was such a thing as Caribbean theology, meaning a critical reflection on Caribbean people, their histories, and their social context within a theological framework. Never heard of it in Jamaica. Particularly, let me not at my Seventh-day Adventist institution. And if I should propose this, then it's going to become a problem, because we already have the prepackaged truth that has been handed down to us from the higher powers down to us common people that we have to accept. And so we have to challenge these things. So it's not just the Anglo-conformity that is a product of the history, but that which emerges from our church structure. The very structure itself that's presenting these things. And so, we have to have some courage about it. Some Holy Ghost boldness about it to say, hey, this cannot continue. Like we have to look deeper at our, I've training in theology and biblical studies, so that's what I know most about. And I can tell you that what we have received, even the methods of interpreting Bible, they are so entrenched in whiteness and white ideas that we have read black people out of scripture. Right? We have done that. So these are things that we have to challenge. And so, you know, when James Cone would make profound and bold points about God being black, right? And he'll talk about, you know, it's the idea that it's not that God is necessarily, his skin color is dark or looks like me, but in terms of, because that itself, the blackness, the whiteness that we've talked about, most of that is socially constructed. But within the theological framework of a God who sides with the oppressed, of a God who loves justice, of a God who loves righteousness, then we know that God has to be black, right? Because he's pro these things. And so when we teach Bible within, whether it's at Pine Forge Academy or over in Tacoma Park or wherever, we have to start to position all people within Scripture, right? We have to help people to understand that the Bible has to be culturally and socially relevant, right? So it has to address present needs. That's what Jesus was about, right? It was about present needs. So, you know, it comes to the history, it comes to every facet of our education system. And then we know that within the church that there's an education committee at the General Conference. There are different versions at the union, the division and the union levels. And so these people have to have this kind of consciousness. But I'm not hopeful because the constitution of these power structures is mostly white folks. So I am not about white people having my liberation at heart, which is my epistemological liberation, my ideological liberation. So until we can get more black bodies in these spaces, and not just any black body, but people who understand the struggle, understand the need to kind of make this a level playing field, then we'll continue to perpetuate these ideas. So we teach theology that's white, we teach history that's white, and we practice Christianity that's white. And so, you know, I got called off the pulpit once because I didn't have a tie in hot Jamaica. I couldn't go preach without a jacket suit on in very burning sun hot Jamaica, right? And because of
I couldn't do
brother,
church with these in Jamaica.
Brother, they want to baptize you.
Right.
You have to cut them first.
Right. To show everyone how deep.
Including you too, Tiffany.
Very quickly, Dr. John Henry Clark, one of our African-American historians and ancestor, said something. He said, Europeans not only colonized lands and people, they also colonized information. So one of the things that I think about often is who decides and who decides who decides. If I was not included in the decision-making process, it's already been decided for me, and all I'm expected to do is conform, and if I don't, then I'm penalized. I made a decision years ago that I'm going to decide, and I will be willing to deal with the consequences of my decisions. Consequences are not always negative, but I would be willing with it. As it pertains to the arts, my sister, there must be a place for the arts, not only within the black church, but in the village also. I have some friends. In fact, one is a pastor in Allegheny East Conference, Pastor Frank Leggett. He's in Pottstown and Norristown. Graduate of Full Sail University, film, who is planning to do black film, spiritual film, for theater. His son went to Full Sail, have 2 degrees. The arts must become prominent among this generation. Film, music. I mean, Oakwood, if they had a right music studio, could take half the business from Nashville, 88 miles away. With all of the talent that comes through there, with vision, there is a place not only for the arts in all of its forms, but the remuneration of those arts to be paid for, to be products and so forth. This generation has to be exposed and also. And so, you know, my thing has always been that we have to start in our friend circles. It's a ripple effect in our social networks instead of maybe trying to get the larger institution or the construct to do certain things. We have to ripple out through our friends and so forth that we're going to get our children. My daughter Portia right now is doing a rites of passage for my granddaughter, taking her through stuff through the year. I wrote a manual on rites of passage. I have manuals. One is called Communiversity, continuing education to the community, where you can take every gift in the church and use it to teach community. But it is a non-proselytizing situation. I have a manual I wrote, Rites of Passage, a transition from boyhood to manhood, womanhood to girlhood to womanhood and so forth, that we need in all of our churches and in the village. I'm finishing up a manual called Man School for black boys ages 13 to 17. I have something called Homeboy, which I'm about to bring out. This is an evidence-based intervention for black heterosexual males, 18 and over, a 12-session group level intervention. My thing is this: if we are not creating institutions, if we are not creating interventions, we are just talking. We have to nation build. We have to do these things, but we must coalesce with those in our circles of influence and all of the children and youth that come into the sphere of our influence, because we cannot wait on an institution to do anything for us, basically. Can't do it.
So, not to belabor the point, because these gentlemen, I think, have already articulated in very eloquent fashion. When you're considering education, information, knowledge, consider the source. Consider the source, because that's going to frame what they're delivering to you or what they want you to take from it. So always keep that in mind. And then regarding the arts, when you look at just across history, you look back in the times of, well, when Rome was the world power, how did they share their knowledge and their information? Through theater. Look at what the Greeks did. When you look at every culture, often they use the arts to get their ideologies across and to share it with the common folk, with the people. So arts are still very important. And I mean, it's still being done today. When you look at theater, images are still going out, propaganda is still going out. The media is just, it's a different source. The media that's being used now is different than what was being used back then. So the arts still have a great impact culturally for us. That was all.
Yeah, so thank you to everyone for your questions, to the panel for just engaging us all in such a rich discussion. And the next step is, what do we do with all of this information? I think we specialize in talking. We do very well in coming together. You know, as Adventists, it's a very educated population demographic. But the question is, what do we do next, and how do we take all of this to affect change in the communities in which we exist in? And so the next step should be for everyone here who feels called or passionate or empowered to do something new, or to just sort of pray and realize their own gifts, to come together and figure out what is needed in this community, in this space, so that this goes beyond just words. And so follow Adventists for Social Justice, www.adventistforsocialjustice.org. And hopefully we can do more work with those of you who live here in the DMV area to just truly affect the change that we're talking about, that we all feel so called to do, and build up our communities and our children. So thank you. I'll hand over to Pastor Adepoju at this time.
So we just want to thank everyone for coming out today. One of the things that I really want to stress is that this right here is Adventism. And one of the things that we don't understand is that because we don't expose ourselves to other people, that we don't hear all these different voices, we don't hear all these different perspectives. And one of the reasons why we started this thing is so that people can get out of their niche and hear what's actually happening in Adventism. And so as we hear these different ideologies, we hear these different voices, we have to come to a point where we really start listening to each other, start building relationships with each other, and start growing together instead of growing in our separate pockets and our separate demographics. And so I'm glad that there was a difference of opinion here, because guess what? That's how we grow. When there's friction, that's how we grow. And so I want to thank all the panelists once again. Let's give them a round of applause for coming up here and sharing your perspectives on this issue. Now, sorry. Oh, yeah. So, honestly, when we said Death to the Ism series, we wanted to say racism to another time, but now that I'm learning, everything's intermingled, but we will actually have a more detailed discussion on that. But we just want to thank you guys for everything and thank everyone who tuned in to watch. One more thing before we dismiss and I do closing prayer. We just want to really encourage everyone to come out tomorrow as well. We will be having a brunch and learn with Dr. Namata Blyden, and she's from George Washington University, and she'll continue this discussion with us as well. So really, after you've heard everything that you've heard here, I want everyone to go back, reflect, and pray about it. Because one of the things that we need to understand is that there is so much happening in our world and in our church that we haven't been exposed to, and we really need to get God's guidance on how to move forward in our denomination and as people. And so if all of you will bow your hands with, 11 o'clock. Sorry, the brunch and learn will be at 11 o'clock. And I've been reminded by my clerk, that God bless her, these programs that we have, they do take money to have. Amen? And so we would be more than happy and more than in gratitude if you would leave a donation in the donation box that's right by the door. So if you've been feel moved, if you want to continue this conversation, like I said, we're talking about sexism next, and that's in August. So if you want to keep enjoying these discussions and coming together, please, help support us as we try to open up our church to these topics and to grow together in Christ. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you so much for just bringing us here today. We thank you for the Sabbath day. We thank you for the minds that you've given us and all the perspectives that were shown today. Father, we just thank you for the fact that even amidst the oppression, Lord, you are still God. You are still in control, Father. And so we lift all these cares up to you, Father, because we can talk about solution. But Lord, only you know solutions that will actually solve these problems, Father. So we want to just keep our focus and look to you, Lord, for the solution, Lord. But help us not to be silent on these issues. Help us not to ignore these issues. But Lord, help us to be at the forefront, to confront these things, to discuss and to grow together in you, Lord. We thank you and we love you. Please grant everyone here safe traveling mercy back home. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You are dismissed. Thank you all for coming.
To integrate your work into the curriculum. Yeah, I think that would be something maybe in ASJ that we can push for. Because if that work is already, if you've done that, you have like...
Yeah, basically, well, I'm almost at the point of copyright now and so forth, but yeah, thank you. You want to stand up?
What's going on?
Just wanted to see you.
Look online and see it.
With them as well.
Oh, God. Sorry. Yeah, man.